I'm Jane, 17, and my family has always been complicated. Growing up, it was clear that my parents favored my older sister, Rachel, and my brother, Lucas. I'd always been the quiet one, the odd one out who preferred reading or watching movies while the rest of my family bonded over loud shared activities. When my dad, who's 50, proposed to my mom, who's 49, on their 25th anniversary back in February, everyone was overjoyed. It was like a renewal, a celebration of their long, unconventional journey together. They decided to have an intimate wedding in Hawaii with only the closest family and friends. Rachel, 25, was named maid of honor, and Lucas, 22, was to be a groomsman. I wasn't surprised. I was used to being overlooked and told myself it was fine. Planning for the wedding picked up quickly. My mom went dress shopping with Rachel and the other female guests, leaving me behind without a second thought. The invitations and travel arrangements were discussed around me, but never with me. I wanted to see if anyone would remember to include me, so I stayed silent, watching the preparations unfold without me. The day before they were set to leave, my mom casually asked if I had my luggage packed. Her face fell when I said, "I haven't packed anything. Do I even have a ticket?" Her expression went pale, and for a moment, there was only silence before the excuses started. They hadn't bought a ticket for me. My dad, who walked in during the conversation, dismissed my concerns with a quick, "You've never been a girly girl, just wear whatever you have." A fight broke out. My parents accused me of being dramatic and making myself invisible on purpose. I couldn't believe it. They blamed me for being forgotten. It all escalated until they told me if I was going to act this way, I might as well not come at all. I nodded and stormed to my room, fury and hurt swelling inside me. The next morning, they left for Hawaii without me. The photos started flooding social media soon after. The perfect beach ceremony, Rachel's daughter as the flower girl, Lucas grinning beside my dad. Friends and family tagged them in comments about how beautiful everything looked. But then, people started noticing I wasn't in any of the photos. The story my parents spun? I had COVID and couldn't travel. That lie lit a fire in me that I hadn't felt before. It was the final straw. I took a COVID test that day, a clear negative result, and snapped a picture of it. I posted it online with the caption, "Not sick at all, just forgotten." I tagged everyone who'd asked about me, including relatives and close friends of the family, making sure the truth was seen. The backlash was immediate. Messages flooded in, some in shock, others in disbelief. My parents' perfect day was overshadowed by the truth I'd laid bare. At first, I felt a bitter satisfaction, but as the days passed and angry texts from my parents and Rachel called me selfish and immature, doubt crept in. I started second-guessing everything. Had I gone too far? Was there a better way to handle this? The loneliness I'd always felt now mixed with a new, gnawing guilt. But then I remembered that moment when my mom's face went pale, the casual way my dad dismissed me, and how they left me behind without a second glance. The bitterness came back, strong and steady, reminding me why I had to speak up. The fallout from my post hit hard and fast. Family, friends, extended relatives, even people I hadn't spoken to in years were messaging me, asking if what I posted was true. The comments varied. Some were supportive, others full of disbelief, and a few even accused me of attention-seeking. But the majority couldn't understand how my parents could forget their own daughter on the biggest day of their lives. My parents and Rachel, however, were relentless. The messages started rolling in almost immediately after my post. First, it was passive-aggressive texts from my mom, calling me immature and accusing me of ruining the happiest day of their lives. Then came Lucas, who sent a short, half-hearted message. "I didn't know you weren't coming, but did you really have to make it public?" The words stung, but not as much as Rachel's voicemail. She accused me of creating drama and turning the entire family against each other. To her, I was the villain. When they returned from their idyllic Hawaiian wedding, the house was like a war zone. They burst through the door with anger in their eyes, their voices like knives. My mom yelled first, her voice cracking as she shouted about how I had embarrassed them. My dad stood behind her, red-faced, muttering words that stung just as sharply. They called me spoiled, entitled a brat. I stood there silent, taking in the barrage. My heart was pounding, but I kept my expression steady, refusing to let them see me break. "You don't understand how hard this was for us," my dad finally said, his tone desperate, as if searching for some sympathy. "We had so much to organize. It was an honest mistake, Jane, but you had to make it public, didn't you?" "An honest mistake?" I repeated, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You planned this wedding for months and never once thought about me until the night before you left? Dot." My mom's eyes flickered, but she stayed quiet, tears gathering in her eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving my dad standing there, looking lost for words. For days, we barely spoke. The tension was palpable, thick like fog. I kept to my room, headphones on, drowning out the noise with music. It was easier than facing the cold, bitter reality that my own parents couldn't even see what they'd done wrong. The only person who reached out without an accusatory tone was my grandmother. She called me 2 days after the post went viral, her voice warm and full of concern. "Jane, sweetheart. Tell me everything," she said. And I did. I poured my heart out, the hurt, the frustration, and the deep-seated loneliness that had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember. There were pauses where she didn't say anything, only listening, but it was enough. Just knowing someone was there, truly listening, was enough. I quote, "I'm so sorry, honey," she finally said, her voice breaking. "You deserve so much better. You're coming to stay with me. I don't care how we do it, but we'll figure it out." A wave of relief washed over me, mixed with guilt. I didn't want her, at her age and with her health issues, to worry about me. But I couldn't deny that the thought of leaving this house, even just for a little while, felt like a lifeline. As the days dragged on, my parents' guilt began to morph into something else: avoidance. They started tiptoeing around me, trying to smooth things over with awkward conversations and forced apologies. My mom would stand in the kitchen, eyes darting to me as she'd mutter, "I'm sorry, like it was supposed to erase everything." My dad couldn't even look me in the eye. But I was done. Done waiting for them to realize the damage they had done. Done hoping they would suddenly become the parents I needed. Grandma's call had given me the push I needed to make a plan. I started packing in secret, gathering my essentials while I figured out the logistics with her and my uncle. The idea of leaving was both terrifying and exhilarating. A chance to start over, away from the suffocating shadow of my parents' neglect. Packing felt surreal. Each piece of clothing, each item I tucked into my bag, was a symbol of both freedom and finality. The house was quieter than usual, as if everyone knew something was brewing beneath the surface, but refused to acknowledge it. My parents had shifted from yelling and accusations to an eerie, detached politeness. My mom would leave folded laundry outside my door without a word, and my dad would mumble half-hearted good mornings over his coffee. It was almost like they were trying to pretend that everything was fine, as if this silence could erase everything that had happened. I stayed out of their way. The walls of my room became my sanctuary, a place where I could think and plan without their looming presence. I kept the door locked most of the time, the sound of their muffled conversations downstairs only serving as background noise to my racing thoughts. My friend Anna, who had been my anchor through all this, texted constantly, offering comfort and ideas. "Come stay at my place anytime, seriously," she wrote one evening. It was tempting, but I didn't want to burden anyone. I needed to do this on my terms, and the call from my grandma was my first step. The morning my grandma and uncle arrived, the tension in the air was nearly suffocating. I hadn't told my parents they were coming. When the knock echoed through the house, it startled everyone. My dad glanced up from the newspaper, eyes narrowing with confusion, while my mom stiffened, a hand frozen mid-motion as she wiped down the counter. I opened the door, and there she was. My grandma looked smaller than I remembered, frailer, but her eyes were sharp and fierce. Behind her stood my uncle, tall and resolute, a silent force of support. The moment I saw them, the weight on my chest lightened a fraction. "Mom, what are you doing here?" my dad asked, his voice tight, defensive. Grandma didn't answer immediately. She walked past him, taking in the room with a glance that seemed to strip away the pretense. "We're here to talk," she said finally, her voice steady. My uncle nodded, crossing his arms as he stood next to her. "And to make sure Jane is okay, Dot?" The air crackled with unspoken words. My parents exchanged looks, a mix of confusion and defensiveness flitting across their faces. My mom's eyes flickered to me, then back to her mother, a hint of nervousness creeping into her expression. "Jane, go get your things," Grandma said, not breaking eye contact with my parents. My heart thudded in my chest as I hurried upstairs. I could hear the low rumble of my uncle's voice, followed by the sharp tone of my dad's reply. My hands shook as I shoved the last of my things into my suitcase, the adrenaline making every second feel stretched and heavy. I didn't linger or try to listen to the argument brewing downstairs. I knew it wouldn't change anything. When I came back down, my mom was sitting on the edge of the couch, head bowed, fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. My dad stood rigid by the window, jaw clenched, eyes staring out into nothing. They both turned when they heard my suitcase thumping against the steps. "Is this what you want?" my mom asked, her voice cracking. There were tears in her eyes, but they didn't reach me the way they once might have. I met her gaze, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "I don't know what I want yet, but I know I can't stay here, Dot." My dad's eyes hardened, the tension in his posture snapping like a rope pulled too tight. "Fine, if this is how you want it, don't expect us to come running when things get hard." Grandma's eyes narrowed, the fire in them burning brighter. "No, she won't need you," she said. "She has people who actually care about her, Dot." My mom buried her face in her hands, shoulders trembling, but I didn't let it sway me. Years of being overlooked, ignored, and made to feel invisible had built a wall around my heart that her tears couldn't break. I stepped out of the house, the cool breeze hitting my face like a promise. My uncle took my suitcase from me, loading it into the car while my grandma squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance that I wasn't alone. As we drove away, I looked back at the house, my parents framed in the doorway, watching with expressions I couldn't decipher. It felt like the end of something, but maybe it was the beginning of something better. The drive to the hotel was quiet, with only the soft hum of the engine filling the silence. My grandma held my hand, her touch warm and steady, grounding me as the reality of what just happened sank in. I stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into the distance. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from outside myself. At the hotel, my uncle helped carry my bags inside, his presence a silent show of support. Once settled in the room, my grandma motioned for me to sit beside her on the small couch. She looked tired, more so than when I'd first seen her, but her eyes were as fierce as ever. "Jane," she began, her voice soft yet unwavering. "You're brave for doing this, for standing up for yourself. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." I nodded, swallowing the lump that had been lodged in my throat since we left my parents' house. I wanted to believe her, but the guilt and uncertainty gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. Was this really the right thing to do? Was it selfish? My uncle sat across from us, arms folded as he leaned forward. "Listen, you've done nothing wrong. You needed to get out of there. We're proud of you for recognizing that." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and before I knew it, I was crying silently, my shoulders shaking as I tried to keep it together. My grandma wrapped her arm around me, holding me close as I let the emotions spill out. The weight of years of feeling unwanted, unseen, it all came rushing out in waves I couldn't control. After a while, the tears subsided, leaving me feeling empty and exhausted. My grandma passed me a tissue, patting my knee. "There's no shame in letting it out," she said, her voice laced with kindness. "You're allowed to grieve what you've lost, even if it's the idea of the parents you deserved but didn't have." That hit me harder than anything else. The realization that I wasn't just mourning the loss of my family as it was, but the family I had always hoped for, the kind that would have remembered me, included me, and loved me without conditions. The rest of the evening passed quietly. My uncle ordered takeout, insisting that I needed a decent meal after everything. We sat around the small table in the hotel room, eating in companionable silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. Not just physically, but emotionally. It was a fragile feeling, but it was there. The next morning, my grandma and uncle had a serious discussion with me about the future. My uncle brought up practical things, where I'd live, how I'd manage school, and whether I needed anything right away. I told them about the plan I'd made with Anna to move into her place temporarily until we could find something more permanent. My grandma's eyes softened as I spoke, pride evident in her expression. "You're thinking ahead," she said, nodding. "That's good, but remember, you don't have to do this alone." I knew she meant it, and it brought a sense of relief that I hadn't realized I was holding out for. Still, I wanted to contribute to my own stability. I talked about looking for a part-time job and balancing it with school. My grandma gave a small smile, the kind that spoke volumes. "Do what you need to feel independent," she said. "But know that I'm here, always." By mid-morning, a plan started to take shape. We would visit the studio that Anna had been eyeing, and my grandma and uncle would help me make a final decision about where to stay. It felt good to have a clear goal, something to work toward, even if it was just a step in the right direction. When we arrived at the studio, it was smaller than I had imagined, and the neighborhood felt a little rough around the edges. My uncle frowned, taking in the cracked paint and worn-out steps leading up to the entrance. Inside, the space was tight, with visible water damage near the ceiling and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I quote, "Am not comfortable with this," my grandma said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's not safe, and it's not what you deserve." I glanced at Anna, who gave a small shrug. "I told you it wasn't perfect," she whispered, "but we'll find something better. And we did. It took a few more days and a lot of searching, but we found an apartment that felt like a fresh start. It was still modest, but it was clean, safe, and within walking distance of campus. My grandma helped sign the lease, and I felt a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. This was happening. I was taking control of my life, building something new. Back at the hotel, my grandma handed me a small envelope. "For the first few months," she said, "until you're settled." I opened it and saw enough money to cover rent and some living expenses. I started to protest, but she shook her head. "Consider it an investment," she said with a smile. In you. Tears welled up again, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude, from the realization that maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd always felt. I hugged her tightly, letting her warmth seep into me. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel impossible. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind of change. My grandma and uncle stayed for a few more days to help me settle into the new apartment. The place wasn't grand, but it was mine, or ours, as Anna reminded me with a grin. We spent those first few days unpacking, arranging the furniture, and turning the small space into something that felt like home. My grandma's health held up, though I could see the toll the trip had taken on her. She brushed off my concerns with a smile and a wave of her hand, insisting she was just fine. "Seeing you safe and taking control of your life was worth every bit of this trip," she said one evening as we sat on the small balcony overlooking the street below. The sky had turned a soft pink, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the lone tree by the building. "Thank you, Grandma," I said, the words barely a whisper. It felt like they weren't enough, like they couldn't capture everything I wanted to say. She looked at me, eyes filled with the kind of unconditional love I had longed for from my parents but found in her instead. "You don't need to thank me, Jane," she replied, squeezing my hand. "Just promise me you'll keep going, no matter what." "I will," I promised, feeling the weight of her words settle warmly in my chest. After she and my uncle left, there was a strange quiet that filled the apartment. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was different. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the tension of unspoken words or the ache of being unseen. Anna and I settled into a routine, balancing classes, part-time jobs, and moments of shared laughter over late-night takeout. The loneliness that had once been so suffocating began to ease little by little, but life wasn't without its complications. My parents' attempts to contact me continued. Every few days, a text or call would come through, each one more desperate than the last. My mother's messages shifted from apologetic to pleading. My father's were shorter and more controlled, but they carried an undercurrent of urgency. They wanted to meet, to talk, to fix things, as if the fracture in our relationship could be mended with a few well-chosen words. At first, I ignored them, too hurt and too wary to consider opening that door. But one evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself staring at my phone, the weight of their messages pressing down on me. My mind drifted back to the last conversation I'd had with my grandma before she left. "You don't owe them forgiveness," she had said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you owe yourself peace. Whatever that means for you." I thought about what peace might look like for me. It wasn't an easy answer. It certainly wasn't going back to the way things were or pretending that the pain hadn't cut as deep as it did. But maybe it meant hearing them out, not for their sake, but for mine. The next day, I called my mother. The silence on the line before she answered was almost deafening, and when her voice came through, it was shaky. "Jane? Mom?" I said, the single word carrying more weight than I expected. "I'm not coming back home, but I'll meet with you and Dad, once." There was a pause, as if she hadn't expected me to respond, much less agree to a meeting. "Yes, of course," she said quickly. "We'll come to you wherever you want. We agreed to meet at a cafe near campus, a neutral space where I could leave if things went sideways. When the day came, I sat at a corner table, my hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The anticipation was a storm inside me, swirling and relentless. My parents arrived together, their expressions strained and uncertain. My father's face was lined with exhaustion, and my mother's eyes were red-rimmed as if she hadn't slept. They looked smaller than I remembered, less formidable, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for them. "Jane," my father started, but I held up a hand. "No. I'm going to talk first," I said, my voice steady despite the tremble I felt inside. "I need you to understand what it felt like to be forgotten, to be left behind, and not just with the wedding, but for years. I felt invisible, unwanted. You pushed me away, and when I needed you the most, you weren't there. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and my father's jaw clenched, but they stayed silent. I took a deep breath and continued. "I'm not here for apologizes that don't mean anything or promises that won't be kept. I'm here to tell you that I'm moving forward with or without you in my life. That choice is up to you, but it comes with conditions. Respect my boundaries and understand that I'm not ready to forgive. They nodded, my father's eyes softening in a way I hadn't seen before. My mother wiped her tears, whispering, "We understand, Jane. We really do. The conversation that followed wasn't a miracle fix, and it didn't end with hugs or declarations of love, but it was a start, a cautious, tentative step towards something that might one day resemble peace. Walking out of the cafe, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The hurt was still there, like a scar that might never fully fade, but it no longer felt like it was holding me back. I glanced at my phone, a message from Anna lighting up the screen. "Dinner's on me tonight. Bring ice cream." I smiled, slipping my phone into my pocket as I walked toward my new home, a place filled with laughter, hope, and the promise of better days. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the one I was choosing to build for myself. And for now, that was enough. I hope this part aligns well with your request. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to explore.